Have you ever wondered how historically accurate the civilization games are? I am not talking about the actual events that take place during a civilization game, of course. Unless the Egyptians built the Eiffel Tower and I missed it. I am talking about the individual pieces that make up the game. The wonders, technologies and civilizations themselves. Civilization is a forex game like many others, but what makes it different is how much emphasis it gives to the historical theme it has chosen for itself. So how much thought actually goes into how it translates history to gameplay? That's the idea behind this series, to take the wonders of Civilization VI one by one, examine the real historical background, and see how that history informed their in-game design. And the more I look into these wonders, the more I realize that Civ is really good at this, with some representations telling us more about their history than you would initially realize. So in this video, we'll be exploring the last remaining of Civ VI's classical era wonders, looking at the real stories behind them, while also asking how accurately the game actually represents them through their effects, requirements and restrictions. And to begin, we'll travel to South America, for the first time in this series, to a ghost city whose real purpose has been a mystery for centuries. As you reach the end of the Inca Trail, through the alpine tundra and the cloud forests, you can start to make out something through the fog. Surrounded by steep cliffs and moist-covered peaks, lies one of the most iconic archaeological sites on Earth. This is Machu Picchu, a city tucked away in the Andean mountains, remote enough to escape destruction by the Spanish conquistadors. Machu Picchu is in many ways surrounded by mystery, with its original purpose still being debated. Was it a royal estate, a ceremonial center, a pilgrimage site? Whatever its exact role, one thing is undeniable. Machu Picchu is one of the most spectacular examples of architecture embracing the geography around it. Rather than flattening the landscape or forcing nature to obey them, the Inca designed the city around the mountains themselves. Terraces follow the slopes of the hill, stairways are carved directly into the rock, and buildings seem to emerge naturally from the mountaintop. Machu Picchu raises a lot of questions, and we will try to explore some of them through the lens of Civilization VI. So let's see how the game chooses to portray this breathtaking wonder. In Civilization VI, Machu Picchu provides the following bonuses: +4 gold, and mountain tiles provide a standard adjacency bonus to Commercial Hub, Theatre Square, and Industrial Zone districts in all cities. Okay, so we have to address the elephant in the room really fast before we begin. Machu Picchu in Civilization VI is a classical era wonder. This is completely historical. Like way off. We know that Machu Picchu was built around the 15th century, which would place it comfortably around the Renaissance era. So why did the game make this decision? There are some explanations. One is of course for reasons of game balance. It's obvious that the developers wanted the wonders to be spread out in the tech and civics trees, so some sacrifices had to be made. Another reason would be that, as we will see, Machu Picchu pairs really well with the engineering tech that belongs in the classical era. The last reason I can think of is a bit more concerning, let's say. It's no secret that the Civilization games have been very Eurocentric in various aspects, no matter how much they try to do the opposite. The most obvious way to see that is in the tech and civics trees that follow the progression of European and later American history almost one-to-one. It's needless to say that not all parts of the world followed this exact progression. Another way that this Eurocentric bias is shown is by making a lot of the indigenous civs of the Americas and Africa to be more powerful in the ancient eras, rather than the eras that are more appropriate for them. The Aztecs are the perfect example of this. So having Machu Picchu be represented in the classical era, while being a wonder very much connected to the Inca Empire, could be seen as a symptom of that habit. I am not saying that the games don't have reasons for these depictions. It's a big topic and it's well outside the scope of this video, but if we are to examine the history behind the game's features, then we obviously have to address that placing Machu Picchu in the classical era is tragically wrong. Okay, so with that out of the way, we can finally talk about Machu Picchu, starting with a quick background of the people that constructed it, the Inca. Andean civilizations developed very uniquely, mostly because they had little to zero contact with any other group before the arrival of the conquistadors. They did not have a written language, but were using the quipu, an interesting system of colored strings that they would tie in certain knots to convey certain information. They also never used money for exchanges, instead having their own system of redistribution, favors, and other material exchanges. The different Andean groups were eventually united under Pachacuti and his successors, who formed the Incan Empire in the early 15th century. The empire expanded very fast through means of war and diplomacy, and it eventually reached from modern-day Ecuador down to central Chile and Argentina. It was the largest empire in America before the arrival of the Europeans. However, it was very short, lasting merely around 100 years. Shortly after their first contact with the Portuguese explorer Aleixo Garcia, the Incan Empire faced a civil war, while also being ravaged by a deadly illness, possibly spread from Mexico. In this weakened state, the Inca were eventually conquered by Spanish conquistadors, led by Francisco Pizarro, who pillaged and looted the majority of their impressive empire. One side, however, was left unbothered, perhaps because of its very secure location, or maybe because it was already abandoned. Let's take a look at what we know about Machu Picchu. This very unique city started construction under Pachacuti sometimes after 1440 AD, and its construction lasted almost until the fall of the Incan Empire, around 80 to 90 years later. To finally start discussing Machu Picchu's in-game bonuses, we can start with the more obvious one. Mountains in Civ VI have a very limited role, being useful to campuses and holy sites, and acting as natural barriers otherwise. Well, with the presence of Machu Picchu, mountains become very useful and an integral part of your Civ's empire, giving you bonuses to pretty much all of your different zones. We can look towards the significance that mountains had to Incan culture to find some explanations for this effect. The Incas, and the Andean people of the time in general, worshipped many deities which were heavily connected to nature and believed to be influencing every aspect of life. The landscape and its features were also worshipped, and the Incas had a particular reverence towards mountains, constructing over 100 ceremonial sites at the summits of many of them, which is a mind-boggling feat if you think about it. It's very obvious that mountains were not an obstacle to the Inca. Machu Picchu itself is the most visible expression of the relationship to them, a city built not despite the mountains, but because of them, integrated into the landscape so thoroughly that it is difficult to tell where the natural rock ends and the construction begins. I like to think of the adjacency bonus that the mountains provide as a representation of how the Inca civilization developed side by side with the Andes mountain range. Now for the gold bonus, I'm a bit conflicted. As I mentioned earlier, the Inca did not use money, instead having their own economic system. But then I remember the bonus that Civ V attributes to Machu Picchu, and how it provides gold while also giving a nice bonus to road connections. One of the greatest achievements of the Incas, apart from their incredible engineering, was just how many roads they managed to build across their vast empire. They constructed a network of more than 30,000 kilometers, something that rivaled even the roads of the Roman Empire. What makes this accomplishment even crazier is the large segments of this road network that was made in incredibly unfavored terrain like steep hills and thick jungle, and much of it still exists to this day. I think that the gold bonus, just how it did in Civ V, could represent this advanced and extended network that brought together so many different parts of the large Incan Empire, undeniably aiding the trade of goods. Another possible explanation for it is that it makes reference to the natural wealth that the Inca Empire possessed. The realm of the four parts, another name for the empire, was extraordinarily wealthy, particularly in gold and silver, which held deep religious significance. Gold was considered the sweat of the sun god Inti, and silver the tears of the moon. The mountains of the Andes were also rich in mineral resources, and the Inca extracted and worked them extensively. So the gold bonus can be read as a representation of that mineral wealth of the mountain landscape and the broader prosperity of the Inca Empire at its height. The wonder requires the engineering technology. I have mentioned this quite a few times already, but the Inca really were extraordinary engineers. To be clear, Machu Picchu was constructed on top of a steep hill, 2,400 meters above sea level, surrounded by rivers. and it still stands perfectly fine. The amount of expertise that is required to accomplish such a feat is difficult to put into words. Machu Picchu's location also receives vast amount of rainfall every year, so the Inca engineers had to protect the construction from landslides and have a way to manage all the pouring water. For these reasons, construction of Machu Picchu actually started from the bottom up, where a bulwark of terraces were built that could take care of the rainwater in an elegant way, while also supporting and giving structure to the mountain. These terraces are a vital element of Machu Picchu, even if less shiny than the city on top. The city itself was also constructed very carefully and with regard to the environment and climate of the area. A complicated drainage system was built all along the city, which would provide the residents with fresh water while also taking care of the rainwater. And finally, the actual stones with which the city was built were quarried on the same hill and were cut with such precision that you could hardly pass a knife through them. And the Inca were able to transform granite, a very hard material, without the use of iron tools, which is also pretty crazy. Machu Picchu is really a masterpiece of engineering, highlighting all the different qualities that made the Inca exceptional. The wonder must be built on a mountain tile that does not contain a volcano. Very accurate restrictions as usual, although Machu Picchu would look even cooler if it was built on top of a volcano, I must say. However, building a permanent settlement on an active volcano is, historically speaking, not a great idea. We already talked about how the Inca venerated the mountains as deities and the general significance they had in Incan culture. Another thing that is worth noting here is that Machu Picchu was built on top of two fault lines, which caused frequent earthquakes. Just another feature that proves how impressive it is for the city to still survive today.
Eagles fly the turrets round and seem to flaunt the sky. They eye those walls now crumbling in decay, and scarce from quiet rest their destined prey.
The in-game quote comes from Samuel Prout Hill, a 19th century writer, and describes a scene of crumbling fortifications on a hilltop watched over by circling eagles. The image he creates is very strong, but it is worth noting that the quote was not written about Machu Picchu, since the site was not widely known to the Western world until 1911, and Prout Hill was writing well before that. However, it does fit the visual atmosphere of Machu Picchu quite nicely. On the note of Machu Picchu's alleged discovery, it is worth mentioning the story of Hiram Bingham III here. Bingham was an American academic, explorer, and politician who in 1911 organized the Yale Peruvian expedition, hoping to find Vilcabamba, the last capital of the Inca Empire. On July 24th of the same year, a local farmer named Melchor Arteaga led Bingham to the abandoned city, which had never been forgotten by the indigenous communities of the surrounding area. Bingham misidentified Machu Picchu as Vilcabamba, and what followed was a significant removal of artifacts from the site, which Bingham took to Yale University, sparking a decades-long dispute between Yale and the Peruvian government that was only resolved around 2012. Bingham's work with National Geographic and his book Lost City of the Incas undeniably brought Machu Picchu to international attention, making it popular enough that it became the largest tourist site in the Andes. However, crediting him as the city's discoverer is misleading. It ignores the fact that he was led by the indigenous people of the area, while we also have evidence of other Europeans and locals leaving their mark on the site some years before Bingham's expedition. Machu Picchu was abandoned sometime in the late 16th century, most likely as a direct consequence of the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. The leading theory is that the site was evacuated rather than destroyed, with its inhabitants either fleeing or being absorbed into the collapsing imperial structure. The Spanish, for their part, never found it. Unlike Cusco and other major Inca centers, Machu Picchu was never looted or demolished by the conquistadors, which is a significant part of why it survived in the condition it did. The centuries that followed saw the jungle slowly reclaim the site, with vegetation covering its terraces and buildings until Bingham's expedition cleared enough of it to reveal the scale of what was underneath. In a strange way, Machu Picchu's remarkably remote location and its abandonment may well have saved it so that we can appreciate it properly today. Apart from my issue with the placement of Machu Picchu in the classical era, and the gold bonus being a bit iffy, I have no major issues with its depiction in Civ VI. The adjacency bonus mechanic is unique among the wonders covered in the series so far, changing how you interact with the natural environment in a civilization level, which fits perfectly with the Incan culture and history. It's a very neat way to indicate that the Incas didn't see mountains as obstacles, but as useful monuments of nature that are to be cared and respected. So all in all, with some historical video game nonsense pushed aside, it's a perfectly fine overall translation. But now, it's time to leave the Americas behind and head towards the humid and fertile lands of Bihar in India, where a sacred fig tree has been drawing pilgrims from across the world for over 2000 years. Bodh Gaya is not an especially grand city in India, but stepping inside the walls of its most sacred complex, the atmosphere changes. The noise of the street fades away, replaced by the low rhythm of chanting and the smell of incense. This is the Mahabodhi Temple, and it is one of the largest centers of Buddhism and one of the most sacred places on earth. Thousands of years ago, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, is said to have attained enlightenment here, under the shade of the Bodhi tree. The temple itself was first constructed under the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, making it one of the earliest Buddhist temples built in brick to have survived into the modern era. The temple has borne witness to nearly 2,500 years of history, and remains one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the Buddhist world today. So let's see how Civilization VI uses the history of the holy site and what we can learn from it. In Civilization VI, the Mahabodhi Temple provides the following bonuses: +4 faith, 2 free apostles, and +2 diplomatic victory points when built. It's very obvious that this is an extremely faith-focused wonder, so let's get a bit into its history and place these effects in a greater context. And I think the best place to start would be to explain how Siddhartha Gautama is connected to Bodh Gaya. Siddhartha was born into a noble family in the foothills of the Himalayas, in what is now southern Nepal. According to tradition, he lived a sheltered and privileged life until he ventured outside his father's palace, and saw the misery and suffering that people face. Deeply affected, Siddhartha left the palace, his wife and son, to understand more about life, human suffering, and how that suffering can be alleviated. He began by denying himself any material goods, following an ascetic lifestyle, where he would go extended periods of time without eating or drinking. After years of this practice, he concluded that neither deprivation nor luxury could bring him closer to his goal, and instead chose a balanced approach, what he called the middle way. He eventually settled beneath a large sacred fig tree in the city of Bodh Gaya. There, he entered a deep and long state of meditation, resolving not to rise until he had found the answers he was looking for. According to Buddhist tradition, after several days of meditation, he achieved a profound state of insight and liberation, understanding the nature of suffering, its causes, and the path leading to its end. This experience is what Buddhism calls enlightenment, and from that moment, Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha, a Sanskrit word meaning the awakened one. Rather than retreating into solitary contemplation, the Buddha spent the remaining 40 or so years of his life walking across the Indian subcontinent, teaching. The teachings spread, and within a few centuries, Buddhism had become one of the most influential religious and philosophical traditions in the world. The site where the Buddha reached enlightenment, under the sacred fig tree in Bodh Gaya, is where the Mahabodhi Temple was built. The faith bonus that the Mahabodhi Temple provides in Civ VI is pretty self-explanatory at this point. The temple is steeped in religious significance, with thousands of Buddhists from all around the world visiting to be able to pray and meditate in one of their religion's most sacred sites. I think that is more than enough to justify a simple faith bonus. As for the 2 free apostles and the diplomatic victory points, we have to introduce the man who ordered the construction of the Mahabodhi Temple and was responsible for the early spread of Buddhism. Ashoka the Great was the emperor of the Mauryan Empire and the 3rd ruler from his dynasty. The Mauryan Empire was one of the largest of the ancient world, stretching across most of the Indian subcontinent. Under the leadership of Ashoka, the empire expanded through military conquest, reaching its peak with the Kalinga War, one of the bloodiest conflicts of that time period. The suffering caused by the war appears to have deeply affected Ashoka. According to his own inscriptions, hundreds of thousands were killed and displaced. In the 13th major rock edict, it is inscribed that Ashoka felt remorse about the Kalinga War, and it is true that after the war's end, Ashoka devoted the rest of his life to Buddhism and its principles, like that of Ahimsa, meaning non-violence, and Dharma Vijaya, a form of moral victory through Dharma. Whether this change of course was indeed a personal matter for Ashoka, or just a calculated political and administrative move, is up to debate. What remains true, however, is that during the rest of his rule, the Mauryan Empire saw great prosperity and peace. It is within this context that Ashoka ordered the construction of 84,000 stupas or viharas, Buddhist temples and monasteries. Arguably the holiest of those was the Mahabodhi Temple, constructed around the holy Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. Now, to explain the three apostles and the diplomatic victory points that this wonder provides in-game, we can look at how Ashoka spread Buddhism around his territories as well as outside of them. It is inscribed in Ashoka's rock edicts that many Buddhist missions were sent all around the ancient world, even reaching the ancient Greeks. This has been referenced as a moral dharmic victory, in contrast to the bloody conquest of Kalinga. I think it is also enough to explain the apostles that the wonder provides in-game, seeing as how apostles in Civ VI are important religious units that can spread religion very easily. As for the diplomatic victory points, I think we can look at Rock Edict number 2, where it is inscribed that Ashoka arranged the medical treatment for both people as well as animals. What is very interesting about this is that this treatment was carried out not only in the territories of the Mauryan Empire, but also in those of its neighboring kingdoms. Whether this is true or just a piece of ancient propaganda, Ashoka was seen as a very gracious ruler after his adoption of Buddhism, and I think that a move like this one would absolutely qualify as something that would give diplomatic victory points in Civ VI. I mean, there are literal World Congress events in-game that are basically handing out diplomatic victory points to the player who helped another civilization the most, so it really fits quite nicely. The wonder requires the theology civic. Buddhism is not a simple or loosely defined belief system. If someone was to study it to its core, they would have to read a vast body of texts and familiarize themselves with sophisticated school of thoughts and large amount of concepts and definitions. I think theology as a civic is a way to represent the formalization of religious belief, treating it as a collection of interconnected disciplines that form a coherent way of life. Treating the Mahabodhi Temple as a representation of Buddhism, theology is a perfectly appropriate civic for it, without question. The wonder must be built on woods adjacent to a holy site with a temple, and you must have founded a religion. I have good news and bad news for this one. To start with the good news, I think that having to place the wonder on top of woods is an excellent and subtle nod to the history of the wonder. The observant among you may have already made the connection to the Bodhi tree, the tree under which the Buddha reached enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. The tree that stands in the Mahabodhi Temple complex today is believed to be a direct descendant of the original, propagated from a sampling taken to Sri Lanka by Ashoka's missionaries in the 3rd century BC and later returned to Bodh Gaya. It is believed that the Mahabodhi Temple has a lot of descendants all around the world, from Hawaii to Japan and Australia, since its seeds and saplings have been used in Buddhist missionary work. Now for the bad news, I am sad to say that this is one more example of that thing that Civ VI loves to do with its wonders. I am of course talking about the redundant need of having a temple in the city before constructing the Mahabodhi Temple. Just let the wonder provide the city with a free temple, it would make so much more sense. This is the 4th time this has happened in this series so far, and I doubt it's going to be the last. So I think it's a good time to introduce the redundant building requirement wall of shame. From now on, all the wonders that require a certain building to be present in the city before being built will be placed here. I wonder how long this list is going to get. But, to end the segment on a more positive note, having the Mahabodhi Temple be next to a holy site is pretty accurate, since Bodh Gaya has many other religious monuments and temples in its premises, like the Great Buddha statue and many other smaller Buddhist temples and shrines.
In a dusty, bustling corner of the Indian state of Bihar, there is a magical place that one might think of as the hub of Buddhism.
The in-game quote comes from... Wait. Really? This must be some kind of placeholder that the developers forgot to change, right? Well, okay. The quote comes from a visitor's guide to Bodh Gaya, and it's not a bad one, it just feels kinda lazy, I guess. Well, the quote describes Bodh Gaya and the Mahabodhi Temple in a quite literal sense. Can't think of much else to comment on, really. All the quotes we've seen so far from the other wonders make less direct references to the wonders, either through poetry, old descriptions, or thematic connections. Some of you may have noticed that in the compilation videos, I am using the Proverbi mod that replaces most quotes in the Little Wonder construction animations. Well, that mod uses a quote from the Digha Nikaya, a collection of Buddhist scriptures, which I obviously prefer from the one the developers chose. Something interesting about the Mahabodhi Temple is that it is the first wonder in this series that is still being used as it was when it was first constructed. However, it is important to note that for the first centuries of the temple's existence, it looked quite different. In the original construction, ordered by Emperor Ashoka in 250 BC, only a monastery and shrine were erected, as well as a diamond throne built under the Bodhi tree. This early temple has not survived, but the most likely scenario was that it was used to protect the Bodhi tree. The current structure, and the one that the game is depicting, was constructed some centuries later, in the 5th or 6th century AD, during the reign of the Gupta Empire. The temple declined over the years, with multiple destructions and restorations happening, but the way it is in its current state resulted from a restoration that was undertaken by the then British colonial government of India in the 1880s. I quite liked learning more about the temple, because admittedly, I know very little about the history of India and Buddhism, so it was a lot of new information for me. It was nice to see that even if the wonders features look fairly straightforward at a glance, there was still some interesting stuff going on. I am mainly referring to the diplomatic victory points and the requirement of the wonder being built on top of a forest, representing the Bodhi tree. Both of those have very nice possible explanations that I could never have imagined if I wasn't making this series. So even if I find the quote choice to be borderline offensive, it's still a pretty good depiction overall. Let's now leave India behind and head towards the Aegean coast of ancient Turkey, to talk about a tomb so large and impressive that the name of the man who was buried there became the de facto word for any large tomb today. Approaching the ancient city of Halicarnassus, there is a magnificent building that dominates the view. This elaborate and huge monument stood there for many centuries, serving as the resting place of a noble couple who wished to have the largest and most elegant tomb of the world. This is the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, where King Mausoleus and his wife and sister, Artemisia II, were buried. Situated in the southern western coast of modern-day Turkey, in the city that is now called Bodrum, this tomb was so famous that the word used for it, mausoleum, started to be used as the default name for any large tomb to this day. Such was the renown of this building that it was listed as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So let's take a look at some of the things that made it so special through the lens of Civilization VI. In Civilization VI, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus provides the following bonuses: +1 science, faith and culture on all coastal tiles in the city, and all great engineers receive an additional charge. I am not going to lie, this was a tough one. Just by looking at the effects that the Mausoleum provides in the various games of the series, you can tell that it's a bit all over the place. But I think I managed to make some connections that at least make a bit of sense, even if I personally don't find them as satisfying as most of the wonders in the series so far. You'll see what I mean shortly, but to get to that, we first need to take a look at the story of Mausoleus and Artemisia to find out why the Mausoleum was even built in the first place. Mausoleus ruled Caria as a satrap, basically an autonomous regional governor, under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, from around 377 to 353 BC. One of his first decisions was to move the capital of his kingdom from Mylassa to Halicarnassus, so that it could be on the coast. Mausoleus spent his entire reign transforming Halicarnassus into one of the most impressive cities of the Greek world. I say the Greek world here because Mausoleus is kind of an interesting figure in that regard. His political allegiances clearly lay with Persia, but as far as his cultural tastes went, he was very much fascinated by Greek artists and architects. as well as the Hellenistic traditions and culture in general. In that way, Mausoleus' Caria was a kingdom where two of the ancient world's most powerful cultural traditions met and blended, with Halicarnassus being the crowning jewel of that fusion. Mausoleus, member of the Hecatomnic dynasty, ordered the construction of walls, theatres, and a temple dedicated to the Greek god of war Ares. He also ordered the erection of a massive monument that would also serve as his tomb after his death. The tomb really was massive, and its construction finished after Mausoleus' death during the reign of Artemisia II. Artemisia was the sister and wife, let's not think about that too much, of Mausoleus, and wanted the monument to be the grandest of its kind, hiring the greatest artists and architects of the era to work on it. She was also entombed in it, alongside her brother, having ruled for just 2 years before dying of grief. The building came to be known as the Mausoleum, named after Mausoleus, and it was so lavish that it was listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, as well as lending its name to every large tomb to this day. Speaking of the construction of the Mausoleum, I think this is as good a time as any to tackle the first effect of the wandering game, probably the most appropriate of the set. In Civ VI, the Mausoleum grants all great engineers an extra charge. I believe this is a reference to the fact that multiple talented architects and sculptors worked to design and construct the Mausoleum, at the request of Artemisia. The tomb was designed by the Greek architects Satyros of Paros and Pythius of Priene. The sculptors who made the large statues that decorated the monument were Leocharis, Firaxis, Timotheus, and Skopas, who also had supervised the rebuilding of the Temple of Artemis. As you can probably tell, hiring such a large amount of talented artists for the construction of a royal tomb was not the most usual thing, and it shows how committed Artemisia was to honor the memory of her brother. In any case, the result spoke for itself, combining architectural elements from different cultures like Greek, Persian, and Lycian, into something with no real precedent. Ancient sources describe it as covered in white marble and topped with a pyramid, crowned by a quadriga, a 4-horse chariot sculpture presumably depicting Mausoleus himself. The whole monument was immediately recognized for its grandeur, and visitors from all across the ancient world would travel there to see it. I think that the bonus regarding the great engineers could be seen as a way to reference the fact that this ancient wonder was a result of a collaborative effort made by so many different and talented people of the time. Now, as far as the second effect goes, I can only assume that it's a reference to the city of Halicarnassus itself, and I have to admit that I find it a bit generic for my liking. As mentioned earlier, Mausoleus was really determined when it comes to turning Halicarnassus into a cosmopolitan cultural center. The city had already claimed a spot in the annals of history as the birthplace of Herodotus, known as the father of history, and the construction of the Mausoleum sealed the deal when it comes to the cultural importance of Halicarnassus. As far as the science and faith bonuses, I couldn't find anything very concrete and specific to tie them to. Maybe the faith bonus could be a reference to the Temple of Ares that I mentioned earlier, but I highly doubt it. It may also reflect the religious role that the Mausoleum acquired after Mausoleus' death, possibly functioning as a site of hero cult worship. The bonus itself being given to just the coastal tiles is also a bit weird, and I can only assume that it's because Halicarnassus was a coastal city, a very important factor for its development. But as I said, I couldn't pinpoint anything specific about the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus that would warrant these bonuses. Looking at how other games in the series implemented the wonder, they seem a bit all over the place. I will say that my favorite version is the one in Civ VII, that makes your cavalry units respawn after being destroyed. I think that's a nice nod to the wonder being a tomb. The wonder requires the defensive tactic civic. I believe this is possibly the most random requirement in the series so far. I have only 2 possible explanations for this, and I don't particularly like either of them, to be honest. The first explanation stems from the fact that Mausoleus was the ruler who ordered the construction of the walls of Halicarnassus. These walls were specifically built to be able to withstand attacks from the recently invented catapults, and you can still see the remnants today. The second explanation results from the final fate of the Mausoleum. Centuries after the wonder was knocked down by a series of earthquakes, a lot of its fallen stones were used by the Knights of St. John of Rhodes to build the Bodrum Castle, which still stands to this day. So you could argue that the eventual fate of the wonder was to be used as a defensive fortress, but it's definitely a big reach. Well, this unlock requirement definitely ranks pretty low compared to the rest of the ones we've seen so far in the series, but they can't all be perfect. The wonder must be built adjacent to a harbour. Halicarnassus was, first and foremost, a harbour city. Mausoleum moved his capital there precisely because of its coastal position, and the city's prosperity was built on maritime trade and naval power. The mausoleum itself was constructed in a hill that overlooked the city, and would have most likely been the first thing that would be visible when approaching the city from the sea. So the harbour requirement just makes sense.
A vast tomb lies over me in Halicarnassus, of such dimensions, of such exquisite beauty, as no other shade can boast.
The in-game quote comes from Lucian of Samosata, a Syrian satirist and rhetorician of the 2nd century AD, and is of his work Dialogues of the Dead, in which the dead speak from the underworld. In the passage that the game chooses, Mausolus is basically bragging about his monumental tomb. What is interesting about this quote is that its tone changes drastically when placed in context. In the work, Mausolus is arguing with Diogenes. Everybody who knows the basic things about Diogenes knows that this conversation would not be in Mausolus's favor. Well, Diogenes claims that for all of Mausolus's accomplishments, and in spite of his extravagant tomb, in the end, they're both just piles of bones. It's just that the bones of Mausolus carry more weight on them, what with all the marble on top. I would like to go over the entire conversation in the video, but it would be too long. Instead, I have linked a translation of it in the description, and I highly recommend giving it a read. As briefly mentioned in the required civic segment, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus survived for over 15 centuries before a series of earthquakes between the 11th and 15th centuries gradually destroyed it. By the time the Knights of St. John arrived in the area in the early 15th century, much of it had already fallen. The Knights used the remaining stone and marble to build the castle of Bodrum, which you can still visit on the same coastline today. Some of the sculptural fragments were incorporated directly into the castle walls, where a handful of them remained until being taken to the British Museum in the 19th century. The site of the mausoleum itself is now an archaeological park in the center of modern Bodrum, where the foundations and some remaining stonework can still be visited. As you have probably gathered, I am not the biggest fan of how the mausoleum at Halicarnassus was translated into Civilization VI. Most of its features just feel a bit generic, with certain ones, like the defensive tactic civic, barely being connected to it. But I can understand that translating a monumental tomb into compelling gameplay mechanics is not the easiest design challenge, something that is pretty obvious when looking at the various other effects that have been given to the wonder in the rest of the series. I do find the great engineering bonus very appropriate though, and if we just focus on that, the significance of the mausoleum as an architectural achievement that was admired for centuries becomes more clear. Let's now let Mausolus and Artemisia rest in peace, and move to a city that was carved into the living rock of the Arabian desert. There is a narrow passage in the harsh desert of southern Jordan that twists and turns for about a kilometer before it reveals a site that was hidden away for centuries. Carved directly into the red cliffs that surround it lies a facade of perfectly preserved columns and pediments. But it is not a facade of a building, but of a tomb, cut into the rock cliff by a people that have been often overlooked by history. This is the ancient city of Petra, the capital of the Nabataean kingdom, now one of the most astonishing archaeological sites on Earth. Let's now explore some of the history of the city and the people that built it by going through its effect and feature that Civilization VI attributes to it. In Civilization VI, Petra provides the player with +2 food, +2 gold, and +1 production on all desert tiles for the city that houses it. As a player who was introduced to this series with Civilization V, I have to say that Petra holds a special place in my heart, and I think Civ VI, like 5, has done a nice job at translating the wonder's history into gameplay. we can begin to explore that history by taking a look at the fascinating Nabataean people. The Nabataeans started off as nomads in the Arabian desert, where they migrated from pasture to pasture to feed their accompanying herds. They eventually settled in an area in what is now modern-day southern Jordan, that allowed them to control the trade of frankincense from Lian to Gaza. Even though the Nabataeans had their own script that developed out of the Aramaic alphabet, they didn't seem to write much about themselves, so much of what we know of them comes from outside sources. The first written mention of the Nabataeans in Petra comes from Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian. Diodorus, describing the Nabataeans as an Arab tribe, gives an overview of their customs, highlighting that they were a freedom-loving people that had mastered the ways of the desert. He also wrote that the Nabataeans were by far the richest of the Arab tribes, as they were traders of frankincense and myrrh. He continues by describing the failed invasion that the Macedonian successor of Alexander the Great, Antigonus Monophthalmus, ordered. From his description of their defense, it is very obvious how well accustomed the Nabataeans were at using the desert as their fortress, while also being able to survive in these harsh conditions even when being threatened. What I found most interesting of all, from Diodorus' account, is the plea for peace that the Nabataeans made to Demetrius, son of Antigonus. King Demetrius, with what desire or under what compulsion do you war against us who live in the desert and in a land that has neither water, nor grain, nor wine, nor any other thing whatever of those that pertain to the necessities of life among you? For we, since we are in no way willing to be slaves, have all taken refuge in a land that lacks all the things that are valued among other peoples, and have chosen to live a life in the desert and one altogether like that of wild beasts, harming you not at all. We therefore beg both you and your father to do us no injury, but, after receiving gifts from us, to withdraw your army and henceforth regard the Nabataeans as your friends. I think this serves as a great indicator that the Nabataeans really made the desert their home, forming a kingdom in a terrain so harsh that most other peoples would disregard without second thought. Because nobody else could move through it efficiently, the Nabataeans became the essential middlemen for trade between Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, cinnamon, and other luxury goods from the east all passed through Nabataean territory on their way to the markets of the Mediterranean through the ancient port of Gaza. The Nabataeans heavily taxed that traffic, and they were also routinely hired to accompany caravans, building a network of way stations and cisterns across the desert that made long-distance trade viable in that harsh climate. Petra sat at the heart of this network, a city hidden in the mountains of the desert, perfectly positioned to control the flow of goods in every direction. I think this is the perfect explanation for the first part of Petra's effect in Civ VI, the one providing gold to its desert isle. It is very clear by now that a defining part of Nabataean identity was their role as desert traders, and Petra was the main commercial hub of their kingdom, so making it provide gold as a bonus is very appropriate. I think this is a good time to mention that even though Petra was a whole proper settlement, the in-game model that Civilization VI chooses to represent it is the iconic facade of Al-Khazne, meaning the treasury. Maybe that also played a part when it comes to the gold bonus. However, archaeologists and historians believe that the building was actually a mausoleum. It seems that the name of the structure comes from a 19th century Bedouin legend, according to which the large stone urn on the top of the facade contains hidden treasure. Now, to explain the food bonus, we can again look at Diodorus' writings, where he mentions that the Nabataeans used the desert as a refuge, hiding reservoirs of rainwater under the sand and making markers for them. They were the only ones that understood these markers and used them to find the hidden water for themselves and their cattle. He also mentions that the Nabataeans were very good herders, as well as excellent desert foragers, harvesting peppers and what they called wild honey from trees native to that terrain. I think it is fair to say that they were more accustomed than probably any other civilization of the time when it comes to surviving from what little the desert gave them, thus justifying the Petra's food bonus. As far as the last and most vague effect regarding the production bonus, I can't really tie it to anything specific about Petra or the Nabataeans. The Nabataeans were skilled craftspeople, producing distinctive pottery that was traded widely across the region, and their stone-cutting expertise is evident from the various structures that were erected in Petra as well as other parts of their kingdom. But neither of these things translates neatly into a production bonus in my opinion. In any case, it does help at making your desert city overall more efficient in-game, which is just fine by me. The wonder requires the mathematics technology. I think there are two reasonable explanations for this. The first and simpler one is that Petra was, above all else, a trading city. The nabataeans had a clear expertise when it comes to creating trade routes and managing their economy in an efficient manner. Having a good understanding of mathematics obviously helps when it comes to these activities. However, I think that mathematics as a technology implies a more precise use of the science, which is not really that important for trading. This brings us to the second explanation, which I prefer. Something that I haven't mentioned yet is the sophisticated water management system that the nabataeans developed. It required careful calculation of slopes, volumes, and flow rates across a complex and varied desert landscape. The system that they created worked so well that when the Romans eventually conquered the nabataeans, they didn't feel like they had to construct aqueducts and water systems, like they did in pretty much all of their other conquered territories. This could possibly mean that they couldn't find anything to improve on the system that the nabataeans had developed centuries ago. Archaeologists have documented just how precisely engineered these systems were, with channels cut to exact gradients to ensure water moved at the right speed without eroding the rock. Engineering a system capable of supplying a large desert city with enough water to survive and even thrive with an estimated population of 20,000 people at its peak is no small feat. And it is a feat that shows a deep understanding of various principles of mathematics. The wonder must be built on desert or desert floodplains. In case it wasn't clear yet, Petra was established in the middle of the desert. So yeah, its entire identity, its architecture, its water systems, all of it is inseparable from the desert environment that surrounds it, so having it be built anywhere but the desert just wouldn't make sense. Petra sits in a system of wadis and seasonal water courses, which also explains why you can build it on top of floodplains as well.
Petra is a brilliant display of man's artistry in turning barren rock into majestic wonder.
The in-game quote comes from Edward Dawson, and it's a bit of a weird one. I can only assume that the quote comes from a travel guide published in 2010, named Travel Through Jordan, Land of Temples, Fortresses and Mosaics. This appears to be the only book written by Dawson. The quote is perfectly fine on its own, it's just a bit weird that the developers chose it instead of something more historical or poetical. I will say that I found it kinda funny that while looking for information for the quote, I could only find it as references to the game of Civ VI. Commenting on the quote itself, the description of Petra as a display of human artistry transforming barren rock into something magnificent is very appropriate. I find something very awe-inspiring when looking at how perfectly the facades blend with the natural landscape. Just how the Inca made Machu Picchu in accordance to the mountaintops, so does the city of Petra seem to live in harmony with the desert cliffs that surround it and encompass it. The Nabataean kingdom managed to withstand attacks from both the Greek Antigonids, as mentioned before, as well as the Hasmonean kingdom in Judea, then ruled by the Judean king Alexander Jannaeus. However, in 32 BC, Herod the Great, the Jewish Roman ruler of the Herodian kingdom, invaded Nabatea and defeated them. The kingdom was finally annexed by the Romans in 106 AD, while they were ruled by Trajan. It fell under the administrative region of Arabia Petrea, and life seems to have continued as normal for the Nabataean people. However, as the city of Palmyra developed to be an increasingly important center of trade in the Middle East, attracting much of the Arabian trade routes, the significance of Petra slowly faded. In the 4th century AD, it served as the capital of the Palestina Salutaris province of the Byzantine Empire. During that period, in 363, an earthquake destroyed large parts of the city, as well as damaging the important water system on which the city was dependent on. The once grand capital seems to have slowly vacated, and by the 7th century Arabian conquests, the ancient cities of the Nabataean kingdom were already abandoned. Other than some castles that were built in the area by crusaders, it seems that the site of the ancient city was mostly left alone, inhabited by Bedouin tribes. This was until, in 1812, Petra was reintroduced to the Western world by Swiss traveller Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, who was led there by locals. Personally, I find Petra in Civ VI to be a simple but classic design. It's easy to look at the bonuses it provides and make assumptions about its history, but even in a design as straightforward as that, there were still interesting things to discover and analyze. Mathematics being the unlock requirement for it is a nice highlight of that. Petra has well earned its place in game as the wonder you go for when trying to make a desert city viable, and I believe this ties in very nicely with the actual history we talked about here. We will now visit ancient Greece for the last time in the series to go to the birthplace of the Olympics and marvel at a giant statue made during one of the most heated eras of the Greek world. In the ancient Greek city that hosted the Olympic Games, there was a temple that housed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Seated upon a golden throne, Zeus held a scepter in one hand and the goddess Nike in the other. The statue was so tall that if it were to stand up, it would destroy the temple's roof. Designed by the sculptor Phidias, who had already proven himself by making the monumental statue of Athena in Athens, the statue of Zeus was so impressive that thousands of people would make their way to Olympia not only to watch and participate in the Olympics, but also to marvel at this magnificent chryselephantine statue. In Civilization VI, the statue of Zeus provides the player with +3 gold, it grants them 3 spearmen, 3 archers and a battering ram, and gives +50% production towards anti-cavalry units across your civilization. So it is immediately obvious that other than the gold bonus, this is a very war-focused wonder. But why? The statue of Zeus was a religious monument, housed in a sanctuary dedicated to the Olympics and the worship of the gods. So why make it a militaristic wonder? And it's not like this is random, seeing as the rest of the games in the series also attribute similar warlike effects to their version of the statue of Zeus. But what is the reason behind this? I'll be honest and say that I struggled a bit when it comes to justifying it. Zeus, while certainly relevant to war as a mythological entity, isn't that connected to it, unlike Ares for example. So that's not enough in my opinion. The next thing that would make sense would be to connect the bonuses to the Olympics, the main event that Olympia, the host of the statue of Zeus, was known for. During the games, a sacred truce was declared across the Greek world, the Kechiria, allowing athletes and spectators to travel safely regardless of whatever wars were being fought at the time. However, the truce was not actually a peace agreement. It was just a guarantee of safe passage, and even that was frequently violated. The Spartans, one of the most successful competitors at the Olympic Games, were banned from Olympia in 420 BC for attacking an alien fort during the Games and refusing to pay the resulting fine. In any case, I don't think all this does well to justify the military-focused bonuses of the statue of Zeus in-game. We'll need to dig a bit deeper. The decision to commission a monumental statue of Zeus for the temple in Olympia was made sometime around 440 BC. The man chosen to create it was Phidias of Athens, arguably the most celebrated sculptor of the ancient world. Phidias' workshop at Olympia, which archaeologists have identified and excavated, was purpose-built to construct something close to the scale of the statue of Athena in Athens, also constructed by Phidias. The statue was finally constructed in 435 BC. The chryselephantine statue depicted Zeus seated on an elaborate throne made of ivory and gold. It stood somewhere between 12 and 13 meters tall, meaning that even seated, it nearly touched the ceiling of the temple. Ancient writers describe the throne as decorated with figures of mythological scenes, precious stones, ebony, and painted images. The figure of Zeus himself held a small statue of Nike in one outstretched hand and a scepter topped with an eagle in the other. Strabo wrote that the sculptor appeared to have captured something beyond an ordinary artistic representation. The Roman general Aemilius Paulus, visiting Olympia after conquering Macedonia, reportedly said that Phidias alone had captured the Zeus of Homer in physical form. What is clear from all these descriptions is that this was a statue that the ancient world understood as something extraordinary. Now, the biggest clue regarding the bonuses that Civ attributes to the wonder is probably the year of the statue's construction. 435 BC places it near the opening years of the Peloponnesian War, the catastrophic conflict between Athens and Sparta that consumed the Greek world for nearly 3 decades. Phidias himself had left Athens due to a political scandal, caught up in the controversies surrounding his patron Pericles, and arrived at Olympia as the war was beginning. The sanctuary of Olympia, which was neutral ground, was being visited by Greeks from city-states that were actively at war with each other. My best guess regarding the developers' intentions when making the wonder provide free military units is that the wonder is meant to evoke the Greek world at the moment the statue was built, with pretty much every Greek city-state preparing for warfare on a massive scale. While the statue of Zeus itself might not be connected to this conflict directly, we can say that the wonder is meant to be more indicative of that general war-centered period in the history of the Greek world. The anti-cavalry production bonus is slightly easier to connect, as being a more general nod to the way the Greek armies of the time were formulated. The dominant military unit of the Greek world was the hoplite, a heavily armored spearman fighting in close formation. The phalanx that hoplites formed was particularly effective against cavalry, as anyone who has played Rome Total War can attest to. Long spears presented a wall of points that made frontal cavalry charges extremely difficult. It is worth noting here that the hoplite in Civ VI is a replacement of the spearman, the first anti-cavalry unit in-game. This means that if the Greek Civ builds the statue of Zeus, they receive 3 hoplites, which is pretty nice and appropriate. If the wonder is gesturing at the martial culture of ancient Greece in general, then a bonus to spear-based units has at least thematic coherence with how Greek armies actually fought. The Spartans in particular built their entire military identity around disciplined phalanx formations of this kind, so the bonus could even be a small reference to Sparta, a city-state that wasn't that far away from Olympia. Again, it is a connection to the Greek culture broadly, rather than to the statue of Zeus specifically, but it is the most historically grounded interpretation I can offer. The gold bonus is the only bonus that I could actually tie directly to the statue of Zeus and Olympia. The sanctuary of Olympia was extraordinarily wealthy. City-states and rulers from across the Greek world sent offerings and dedications to Olympia as acts of religious devotion, and the site amassed great treasure and developed through the years. The Olympic Games also generated significant economic activity, drawing enormous crowds every 4 years, something that merchants would obviously try to take advantage of. So the gold bonus in my eyes is a representation of all this elevated economic activity at Olympia, resulting from both its religious significance as well as the presence of the Olympic Games in its premises. The wonder requires the military training civic. Well, at least this requirement has internal consistency with the bonuses. Greek society placed great value on physical excellence, discipline, and martial ability. Athletic training and military training often overlapped considerably, especially in Sparta. Even in other Greek city-states, the ideal citizen was expected to be both physically capable and ready to defend their polis. So this requirement once again leads us to the general military preparedness of the time when the wonder was constructed, while hinting a bit towards the ancient Greeks' attitude towards athletic training. The wonder must be built on flatland, adjacent to an encampment with a barracks. Boy, they really made this a martial wonder, didn't they? Well, the sanctuary of Olympia was a sacred site, not a military installation, and the city wasn't even that flat to be honest. I understand that the designers needed a placement condition that matched the wonder's bonuses, but this creates a dissonance that is very difficult to ignore when trying to historically explain these effects. This is probably the worst placement requirement so far in the series.
Upon the head of the god was an olive crown. In his right hand he bore a winged figure of victory.
The in-game quote comes from Samuel Augustus Mitchell, a 19th century American geographer and map publisher, from one of his educational geography texts. It is a simple quote and describes 2 characteristics of the ancient statue. Honestly, I would have found the quote by Dio Chrysostom or Strabo to be more fitting, since they talked about the statue with more reverence, obviously being awed by it. Not the worst quote so far, for sure, but maybe a missed opportunity. The statue of Zeus survived at Olympia for many centuries. The sanctuary was closed by Emperor Theodosius I in 393 AD as part of his broader suppression of pagan religious sites, and the Olympic Games were discontinued at the same time. What happened to the statue afterwards is unclear. One ancient source suggests that it was transported to Constantinople, where it was later destroyed in a fire. Others believed it was destroyed at Olympia itself. What remains certain is that, like almost all 7 of the wonders of the ancient world, the statue of Zeus did not make it to the modern era. Today, only the temple's foundations remain, but interestingly enough, the workshop of Phidias was identified by the discovery of tools, ivory fragments, and a cup with the inscription, "I belong to Phidias." Pretty cool that archaeologists could identify one of the greatest sculptors of the ancient world by finding his coffee mug. Overall, I am a bit sad to say that the statue of Zeus is one of the weaker wonder designs in Civilization VI. The gold bonus works, but is still a bit weak, and the anti-cavalry production bonus has a thematic connection to Greek martial culture, but it is indirect. The free military units are a bit of a stretch, the placement requirement is straight up ahistorical, and the civic unlock does not connect to the historical statue of Zeus in any meaningful way. The thing that frustrates me the most about this is that it is not a one-off thing. As I mentioned earlier, pretty much every version of this wonder in the Civ series follows a similar pattern, which makes me think that I'm missing something very obvious, but I really can't think of anything. If anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear them, however. To end on a positive note, while Civ VI's statue of Zeus may not perfectly represent the actual wonder, it does a pretty good job representing the world that stood around it. Visiting China for the first time, it is time to take a look at an extraordinary site that was dedicated to one of the most influential figures in Chinese history. In 1974, a group of farmers digging a well in the Shaanxi province of China struck something unexpected a few meters below the surface. What they had found turned out to be one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Beneath the dry earth, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers were laid to rest, arranged in battle formation, each one with a distinct face. They had been down there for over 2,000 years, standing guard in the dark, waiting. This is the Terracotta Army, the funerary monument of Qi Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China and one of the most recent and important archaeological findings. In Civilization VI, the Terracotta Army provides the following bonuses: +2 Great General points per turn, all current units gain a promotion level, and all archaeologists may enter foreign territory without open borders. So, it is pretty obvious that this is a militaristic focused wonder in-game, but to better understand why these effects were attributed to it, we can begin by examining who Qi Shi Huang was and why he felt the need to bring an entire army with him into the afterlife. Qin Shi Huang, initially known as Ying Zheng, became king of the state of Qin at the age of 13 in 246 BC. China at the time was a world of competing kingdoms, continually at war with each other, in what historians call the Warring States period. Ying Zheng spent the first decades of his reign methodically conquering each of them, one by one, until by 221 BC he had unified all of China under his authoritarian rule. He then declared himself Qin Shi Huang, meaning First Emperor of Qin, an ambitious title for the then 29-year-old. Qin Shi Huang's reign is probably one of the most consequential of all of China's history. He standardized weights, measures, and writing across the empire while laying down the foundations of what would become the Great Wall. He also built a vast network of roads and canals, and he centralized power in a way that would shape Chinese governance for centuries. However, Qin Shi Huang was also a very authoritarian and ruthless ruler, while being obsessed with the concept of immortality. He sent multiple expeditions to search for the elixir of eternal life, most of which never returned, obviously fearing the consequences of their failure. Huang's paranoia was not entirely unfounded for sure, having survived multiple assassination attempts. His life and legacy is honestly just too long for this video, so I think this is a nice place to start focusing on the wonder. Huang began construction of his tomb almost immediately after becoming king, a project that would consume the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers for decades. The tomb complex was truly enormous. The burial mound itself has never been fully excavated, and ancient sources describe it as containing rivers of mercury, crossbow traps, and a miniature model of the empire he had built. The Terracotta Army, however, is not inside the tomb, but in the pits surrounding it, stationed almost like a protective force for the emperor in the afterlife. Over 8,000 clay soldiers have been identified so far, each with their own unique features, along with cavalry, chariots, acrobats, musicians, and bronze birds. The army is organized with the same structure as the actual Qin military force, with everyone arranged in proper formation. Civilization VI, for its part, makes the Terracotta Army provide extra great general points, the reasoning for which should be pretty clear from the brief history I went over before. Qin's Wars of Unification was a testament to Qin Shi Huang's abilities as a ruler and a commander. In just 9 years, his armies were able to conquer all 6 of the states remaining in China, one by one. If great general points in Civ VI represent the accumulation of military leadership and strategic expertise, then I can't think of a more appropriate bonus to be given for the army that protected the tomb of one of China's most important conquerors. As for the similarly militaristic and powerful effect of the wonder providing a free promotion to all units, we can again look towards the Qin's military accomplishments. I think this bonus represents the military system that Qi Shi Huang inherited and perfected. The Qin army was exceptionally well organized, using standardized weapons and carefully managed logistics for the time period. Most importantly to the effect we're examining, Qin rewarded military success through a merit-based system that allowed soldiers and officers to advance according to their achievements rather than their noble birth. Even if it's not an exact one-to-one comparison, I like to think of the promotion effect that the wonder provides as being a small hint towards that system of military organization. It just makes sense to me. Now, the last of the effects is by far the most unique and interesting one, and is totally different than the rest. How does it make any sense at all for the Terracotta Army to allow your archaeologists to enter foreign terrain without permission? It really comes out of nowhere. Well, I think a unique effect such as this deserves some deeper digging. The Terracotta Army was discovered by accident in 1974 by a group of Chinese farmers who were digging in the area. So tying the effect to the archaeological discovery of the wonder doesn't really make sense to me. Instead, I think the most interesting explanation comes from looking at what the Terracotta Army has become in the decades since its discovery. The exhibition history of the Terracotta Army is actually quite extensive. Since the first international showing at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne in 1982, the figures have travelled to museums across the world. The British Museum's first Emperor exhibition in 2007 became the museum's most successful year on record, drawing more visitors than any other show since the Tutankhamun exhibition in 1972. Tickets sold out so fast that the museum extended its opening hours until midnight, and crowds on Chinese New Year were so intense that the gates had to be shut. The Terracotta Army is one of the most unique historical artifacts, and China has definitely made sure to display its importance to the whole world. In that sense, I like to think of the archaeologist-related bonus as a hint towards that immense international outreach that the Terracotta Army managed to have through its many popular exhibitions. The open borders being able to be ignored is still a bit weird though, which leads me to another possible but darker explanation. This one is based on the Century of Humiliation, a term that is used for the period between roughly 1831 and 1941, during which China lost significant sovereignty over its territory and its cultural heritage to foreign powers, most notoriously exemplified by the burning and looting of the old Summer Palace. Western and Japanese expeditions removed enormous quantities of Chinese artifacts during that period, often under agreements that China had little real power to refuse. Through that lens, a mechanic that allows your scholars to enter foreign lands and extract cultural artifacts without permission takes on a pretty different character. I am not really sure that the developers had this in mind when making the wonder though, especially since it would be a bit ironic to provide the effect to a Chinese wonder. The wonder requires the construction technology. Constructing the mausoleum was definitely an extraordinary engineering effort. According to historian Simon, 700,000 people were conscripted to work for the construction of the mausoleum complex. Massive underground chambers were excavated and filled with thousands of clay warriors made in enormous kilns, each equipped with actual weapons. Craftsmen were ordered to construct crossbow traps, and mercury was poured to resemble flowing rivers under moonlight. The mausoleum was basically an underground city on a massive scale, and the Terracotta Army was stationed right beside it for its protection. It's needless to say that even if Simachion's descriptions are not that accurate, none of this could exist without a pretty advanced understanding of construction and engineering. The wonder must be built on grassland or plains adjacent to an encampment with a barracks or stable. I was debating whether this restriction deserved a place in the redundant building requirement wall of shame, but I think ultimately it doesn't, since the Terracotta Army was never really a military installation in the first place. The grassland or plains requirement is a reasonable representation of the landscape around the actual site in Shaanxi province, which sits in the Wei River Valley, a fertile agricultural plain. However, the encampment restriction is straight up historical, since the actual site was a mausoleum. It does make great thematic sense, however, so I can't be mad about it.
There were 7 wonders in the world, and the discovery of the Terracotta Army, we may say, is the 8th miracle of the world.
The in-game quote comes from Jacques Chirac, the former president of France, who visited the Museum of Terracotta Warriors in 1978 and was obviously awed by it. Chirac was actually the very first foreign dignitary to view the Terracotta Army, but many more leaders of states would follow. Describing the Terracotta Army as the 8th wonder of the world is a sentiment that many people have expressed about the site, and I can really understand why that is. The sheer scale of it, paired with how well it was preserved for thousands of years, really makes its discovery one of the most important ones in all of history. The Terracotta Army remained sealed and largely intact for over 2,000 years, partly because the tomb complex was never successfully looted at scale, and partly because its location was not widely known until the 1974 discovery. Excavations have been ongoing ever since, and the site is still not fully explored. The main burial mound of Cixin Huang himself has not been excavated, with archaeologists fearing that modern excavation techniques could irreversibly damage whatever survives inside. So there is still a lot to learn about this ancient wonder. Modern sensing technology has confirmed the presence of remarkable features beneath the mound, including unusual high concentrations of mercury, that appear to confirm at least some of Simachion's extraordinary descriptions of mercury rivers inside the tomb. I really like the Terracotta's army design in Civ VI. It doesn't get everything perfect, but it follows a clear theme, and the bonus to archaeologists makes it feel very unique when looking at it through a historical lens. The wonder itself is incredibly evocative, and I think that the developers did a very good job at translating this into gameplay, while also leaning into its actual history in some very satisfying ways. The promotions being tied to the actual military merit system, for example, is very cool. For a wonder that has only been known to the wider world for 50 or so years, it has been given a very nice and thoughtful interpretation in-game. So there we have it. With this, we've been over every single ancient and classical era wonder of Civ VI. There's plenty more to discover, however. I have a lot of fun making these videos, and I keep being surprised at some of the more unique historical facts that I come across while trying to justify all the effects and tidbits. If you enjoyed this type of analysis, I recommend checking out the previous videos I've made as well, and follow the channel for more similar content coming soon. Thanks for watching.